The hospital at night moved differently than it did during the day. The lights were dimmer, the voices softer, the footsteps slower. In the medical ward on the 4th floor, most doors were half closed, and the hallways carried the low mechanical rhythm of heart monitors and oxygen pumps. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows, blurring the orange glow of the streetlights below. It was the kind of night that usually passed without incident, the kind of shift nurses quietly hoped for. At the center station, 2 nurses spoke in low voices while reviewing charts on the computer. A third scrolled through medication schedules. The ward held 23 patients that night, most recovering from surgery or long observation cases. Nothing critical, nothing urgent. At the far end of the hallway, the newest night nurse moved silently between rooms. Her name badge read Elena Ward, RN. She had started working nights only 3 weeks earlier. Most of the staff still thought of her as the quiet one. She spoke only when necessary. She never joined the break room conversations. She finished tasks without reminders and rarely asked for help. Tonight, she pushed a medication cart down the hallway, checking the small printed list attached to the top tray. Her movements were controlled and precise. She paused outside room 412, listening for a moment before entering. Inside, an elderly patient slept under thin blankets, an IV line running from the stand beside the bed. Elena checked the monitor first. Heart rate steady, oxygen normal. She adjusted the IV flow by a few millimeters and recorded the time in the patient chart. She did not rush. She never rushed. When she stepped back into the hallway, she paused again, briefly scanning both directions before continuing toward the nurse's station. It was a small habit no one had commented on yet, but she did it every time she left a room. At the station, one of the nurses looked up. "Everything quiet down there?" he asked. Elena nodded once. "Yes." Her voice was calm, even. She returned the medication cart and began updating the digital chart entries. Around her, the ward moved through its slow midnight rhythm. A ventilator alarm sounded briefly from one room before being silenced. Somewhere farther down the corridor, a patient coughed. The security officer assigned to the floor walked past the station, his radio crackling softly with a routine status check. Elena noticed everything without appearing to notice anything. Her eyes moved quickly across the ward monitors mounted above the desk. Room numbers, heart rates, oxygen levels. A few numbers shifted, nothing dangerous, just normal fluctuations. But she remembered each one anyway. A nurse beside her sighed. "I swear nights are either dead quiet or complete chaos," she said while rubbing her eyes. "There's never anything in between." Elena did not respond. She simply continued typing. Outside the windows, the rain began to fall harder. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The hospital settled deeper into its nighttime stillness. The clock above the station quietly turned past 2 a.m. Elena finished the chart entries and stood. She moved toward the hallway again, carrying a small tray with medication cups prepared for the next round. Halfway down the corridor, a patient door opened slowly. A middle-aged man stepped out wearing a hospital gown and gripping an IV pole. He looked confused, disoriented. "Sir," Elena said gently, already guiding him back toward the room. "You should stay in bed." "I heard shouting," the man murmured. "Thought something happened." Elena listened carefully. The hallway remained calm. No raised voices, no rushing footsteps. Nothing unusual. "It's quiet," she said. "Let's get you back to bed." The patient allowed her to guide him inside. She helped him settle under the blankets again and adjusted the IV line before leaving the room. When the door closed behind her, the ward felt quiet again. Almost too quiet. Elena walked slowly back toward the station. As she approached, she noticed the security officer speaking into his radio again. His voice sounded lower this time, more focused. The nurse beside him frowned slightly. "Everything okay?" she asked. The officer nodded. "Probably nothing. Dispatch checking something across town." Elena did not ask questions. She simply resumed preparing medications, but her eyes moved once more toward the hallway exit sign at the far end of the ward. A few minutes later, the rain outside intensified, wind pushing droplets hard against the windows. Somewhere deep in the hospital building, a metal door slammed shut with a distant echo. One of the nurses looked up. "That wind is getting bad," she muttered. Elena placed the last medication cup on the tray. The moment stretched quietly across the ward, and then a phone rang. It was not the main desk phone. It was not the nurse station line. The sound came from the wall beside the trauma supply cabinet. A sharp electronic ring that cut through the quiet hallway, the secure emergency line. Very few people in the hospital even knew what it was for. The nurses at the station exchanged confused looks. "Who calls that line?" one asked. The phone rang again. Elena turned toward it. For a moment, no one moved. The ring sounded again, louder in the silent hallway. Elena stepped forward and lifted the receiver. "Ward nurse," she said calmly. There was a pause on the line. Static filled the silence for a moment. Then a man's voice spoke, controlled but urgent. "Listen carefully," he said. "This is not a normal call." Elena said nothing. The voice continued. "An armed hostage situation began 30 minutes ago downtown. One of the suspects was brought into your hospital earlier tonight under another name." Elena's expression did not change. At the station behind her, the other nurses were now watching closely. The voice on the line spoke again. "The hostage takers just made a demand." Another pause, then the sentence that changed the night shift forever. "They want to speak to the one person in that hospital trained to handle this." Elena's fingers tightened slightly around the receiver. The man on the line spoke quietly. "We know who you are." The ward behind her remained silent. Monitors continued their steady beeping. The rain hammered the windows, but Elena Ward, the quiet night nurse who had barely spoken to anyone during 3 weeks of night shifts, suddenly stood very still. The man's voice lowered. "And we need you to confirm something before this gets worse." He paused only a moment before asking the question, "Are you still operational?" Elena did not answer immediately. The question hung in the quiet hallway while the rain continued striking the windows in steady waves. She kept the receiver against her ear and let the silence stretch just long enough to think. Behind her, the nurses at the station watched with growing curiosity. To them, it still looked like a strange phone call, nothing more. Elena's eyes moved slowly across the ward while she spoke in a low voice that carried no emotion. "Identify yourself." The man on the line did not hesitate. Federal Crisis Response Liaison, attached to a joint task unit currently handling the situation downtown. Another pause followed, then he added something only a small number of people would recognize. A designation. A short operational code. Elena's gaze lowered slightly. The code was legitimate. It belonged to a compartmented channel used only in very specific circumstances. Her expression remained calm, but the muscles in her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I am not active," she replied quietly. "You called the wrong person." On the other end of the line, the man exhaled slowly. "With respect, that is not accurate." Elena said nothing. The ward around her continued its quiet routine. A patient coughed behind a closed door. A monitor alarm chirped once and stopped. The other nurses had returned to their screens, assuming the call was some kind of administrative issue. Only the security officer still watched Elena from across the desk, his instincts telling him something about the conversation was unusual. The voice on the line continued carefully. "One of the armed suspects involved in the hostage incident was admitted to your hospital earlier tonight under a false identity. He arrived with a gunshot wound." Elena's eyes lifted toward the patient board mounted above the station monitors. She scanned the names quickly. Admission times, room numbers. One of the entries caught her attention. A patient admitted just before midnight. Emergency surgery, bullet wound to the lower abdomen, registered under a name that did not match the typical identification pattern used by the city hospital system. She had noticed it earlier, but had not questioned it. Hospitals often received unidentified trauma patients. The man on the line spoke again. "Our intelligence indicates the hostage group knows he is there. They are demanding confirmation that he survived the surgery." Elena's voice remained steady. "Why contact this ward?" "Because the patient is in your ward." Elena felt the smallest shift in the air around her. The quiet night shift suddenly felt less routine. She glanced down the corridor toward the rooms near the end of the hall. One of them contained the patient the man was describing. She had checked his IV line less than an hour earlier. At the time, he had been sedated and stable. Nothing about him had appeared unusual beyond the wound itself. But now the situation around him had changed completely. The man continued. "The hostage takers believe someone in your hospital is capable of communicating directly with them." Elena lowered her voice slightly. "They are wrong." "No," the man said calmly. "They are not." Elena remained silent. The ward clock ticked quietly above the station. Somewhere below the building, a siren wailed briefly before fading into the rain. You were not supposed to be in that hospital, the man added. But you are, which makes you the only trained operative inside the perimeter. Elena's fingers rested lightly against the phone receiver. The past he was referencing was one she had left behind deliberately. Night shifts in hospitals were supposed to be quiet places to disappear, places where people stopped asking questions, but the world outside rarely respected quiet exits. The suspect you admitted, the man continued, was part of a 3-man unit involved in a coordinated kidnapping this evening. 2 hostages are still alive as far as we know. Elena's eyes closed briefly. 2 hostages. That meant the situation was already unstable. The other suspects? She asked. Still armed, still mobile. Elena looked again toward the far hallway. The patient room containing the wounded suspect was only 30 steps away. A single nurse was assigned to monitor him overnight. She felt the shape of the problem forming clearly in her mind now. If the hostage takers confirmed their wounded partner was inside the hospital, the location itself could become leverage. Hospitals were vulnerable environments, large buildings, many civilians, limited security, a perfect pressure point for desperate criminals. The man on the phone seemed to follow the same line of thinking. Local police have established a perimeter around the hostage location, he said. Negotiations are ongoing, but the suspects just added a new demand. Elena waited. They want proof their man is alive, and they want to hear it from someone who understands operational protocol. Elena's expression remained neutral. You believe they expect a field-trained response? Yes. The hallway lights flickered once as the building generator shifted power during the storm. Elena noticed the security officer looking toward the windows again. His radio crackled with another dispatch call. Security confirmed status of hospital entrances. The officer answered automatically while Elena continued listening to the voice on the phone. We intercepted a message 15 minutes ago, the man said quietly. If they believe their partner has been captured or is dead, they will begin executing hostages. Elena's gaze returned to the patient board again. Room 417. The wounded suspect. Sedated but stable. Alive. Her voice dropped slightly lower. You want me to confirm his status? Yes. And then what? There was a pause on the line before the man answered. Then we keep them talking. Elena felt the weight of the request settle into place. Negotiations with armed hostage takers were delicate under the best circumstances. Doing it from inside a hospital ward filled with sleeping patients was something else entirely. A nurse approached the station behind Elena. Do you need that trauma kit signed off? She asked casually. Elena covered the phone briefly. One moment. The nurse nodded and walked away again. Elena returned to the call. You understand what you're asking, she said quietly. Yes. You are involving a civilian medical facility in an active negotiation. We are already past that point. Elena did not argue. She already knew he was correct. The moment the wounded suspect had been admitted, the hospital had become part of the crisis, whether anyone inside realized it or not. The voice on the line softened slightly. We would not have called if there was another option. Elena looked down the hallway again. The ward still appeared calm. No one else understood what was unfolding yet. That calm would not last if the situation escalated. She spoke slowly. The patient is alive. The man on the phone exhaled quietly in relief. Good. He is sedated, she added, under observation. That may be enough. Elena remained silent for a moment before asking the question that mattered most. Do the hostage takers know which hospital? There was another pause. Not yet. Elena's eyes moved once more toward the hallway exit doors and the stairwell beyond them. Her mind was already calculating possibilities. If that information changed, the entire building could become a target within minutes. The man spoke again, his tone now more urgent. We need to know if you are willing to assist. Elena did not respond immediately. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city skyline. The hospital monitors continued their steady rhythm behind her. Finally, she spoke quietly into the receiver. Tell me exactly what they are asking for. The man answered with a single sentence, and as Elena listened, she realized the quiet hospital night was about to change in ways none of the other staff on the ward were prepared for. Elena ended the call without drawing attention. She placed the receiver back on its mount beside the trauma cabinet and stood still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the ward. Nothing had changed on the surface. The monitor still pulsed quietly above the nurses' station. Rain continued striking the windows in steady waves. One of the nurses laughed softly at something on the computer screen. To them, the night remained routine. Elena picked up her chart tablet and walked calmly toward the center station. "Room assignments," she said quietly to the charge nurse. "Can we shift 2 observation patients closer to the main desk?" The nurse looked up. "Why?" Elena did not hesitate. "One of them has unstable oxygen patterns, easier to monitor if they are closer." The explanation sounded reasonable. In hospitals, adjustments like that happen often during night shifts. The charge nurse nodded. "All right, which rooms?" Elena pointed at 2 numbers on the board. The change did 2 things at once. It moved vulnerable patients closer to staff supervision, and it cleared the far end of the corridor where the wounded suspect was recovering. She walked down the hallway again with the same calm pace she had maintained all night. Inside room 417, the man lay motionless under the dim surgical lights. His chart listed a false name, but Elena now knew exactly who he was. His abdomen was wrapped in fresh surgical bandaging. A ventilator tube was not necessary, but oxygen tubing rested beneath his nose. The monitors showed stable readings. Heart rate controlled, blood pressure slightly low, but acceptable. Elena stepped closer and checked the IV line with quiet precision. She studied the man's face briefly. Late 30s, hardened features, a faint scar near his temple that looked older than the current injury. People like him rarely entered hospitals under ordinary circumstances. Her eyes shifted to the door and then back to the monitor readings. Alive, stable, valuable leverage for men holding hostages somewhere across the city. Elena adjusted the IV pump by a small amount and made a note on the chart. When she stepped back into the hallway again, the security officer was walking toward her. "Everything all right down here?" he asked. Elena nodded. "Yes." The officer glanced toward room 417. "That trauma patient giving you trouble?" "No." The officer studied her for a moment. Something about Elena's posture seemed different now. Not tense, but more alert. "Dispatch mentioned police activity downtown," he said. "Something about a hostage situation." Elena kept her expression neutral. "I heard something similar." The officer shrugged slightly. "Long night for someone." Elena said nothing. She simply continued toward the nurses' station. Her mind was already working through the layout of the hospital floor. Stairwells, elevator banks, emergency exits. The ward itself had only 2 main access points, both visible from the central station. Good visibility, limited cover. If someone attempted to enter quickly, the staff would have almost no time to react. Elena returned to the station and quietly repositioned 2 medication carts closer to the hallway intersection. It looked like simple organization. In reality, it created partial barriers that would slow anyone rushing through the corridor. A nurse beside her noticed. Rearranging again, Elena gave a small nod. "Easier access for morning rounds." The nurse accepted the explanation and returned to her charting. Elena glanced once more at the ward monitor screen. Every patient room displayed vital signs. 23 lives sleeping behind thin wooden doors, none of them aware that a man connected to an armed kidnapping was lying only a few rooms away. The phone at the station buzzed briefly. Not the secure line this time, a normal internal extension. The charge nurse answered. "4th floor medical." She listened for a moment, then looked toward Elena. "Emergency department asking about your trauma admission earlier tonight. They want confirmation the patient stabilized after surgery." Elena stepped forward and took the receiver. "This is Ward." The voice on the other end was calm but familiar, the same man from the earlier call. "We are still negotiating," he said quietly. "They want proof their partner is alive." Elena kept her voice steady. "He is stable." "Good." A pause followed before the man added, "But they are becoming impatient." Elena looked toward room 417 again. The hallway lights reflected faintly off the polished floor. "What exactly are they demanding now?" she asked. "They want to hear a medical professional confirm his condition directly." Elena understood immediately. Hostage takers often looked for signs of deception during negotiations. Hearing the voice of someone physically near their wounded partner would reassure them the information was real. "You want me to speak to them?" "Yes." Elena did not answer right away. She watched the security officer walk slowly past the station again, checking the corridor as part of his routine patrol. None of the hospital staff understood that a negotiation with armed criminals might soon run through their quiet ward. "There is another concern," the man on the line continued. "What concern?" One of the suspects asked a specific question. Elena waited. He asked whether anyone in that hospital had military training. Elena's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why?" "Because the wounded suspect apparently mentioned someone before he lost consciousness." Elena felt a small shift in the situation. "What did he say?" The man answered carefully. "He said someone in the room moved like an operator." Elena remembered the brief moment in the emergency department earlier that night. The wounded man had been half conscious while she helped stabilize the surgical team's equipment. Even injured, trained eyes sometimes noticed small things. How someone stood, how they scanned a room. Elena's voice remained controlled. He was heavily medicated. "Yes," the man agreed, but the hostage-takers heard the comment over their radio feed. Elena looked slowly around the ward again. The calm environment now felt fragile. One wrong move could draw attention to the hospital. "They are asking for proof," the man continued. "If they suspect deception, the hostages may not survive." Elena exhaled quietly. The problem had become clear. She could remain silent and allow negotiators to improvise, or she could step into the conversation and reduce the risk of violence. But doing so might reveal far more about her presence than she wanted anyone to know. A nurse approached the station again. "Medication check for 418, she said. Elena nodded and handed over the tray. The nurse walked away. Elena returned to the call. "Put them on the line," she said quietly. There was a pause on the other end. "Are you certain?" "Yes." Elena looked toward the hallway, where the wounded suspect lay unconscious. "But we do this carefully." "Understood." The man's voice lowered further. "They are connecting you now." Elena waited. Across the ward, monitors continued their steady rhythm. The rain outside the windows softened slightly as the storm began moving farther across the city. For a few seconds, the hospital returned to its calm routine. Then a new voice entered the line. Rough, controlled, dangerous. "You're the nurse?" Elena answered without hesitation. "Yes." Silence stretched across the connection. The man spoke again. "My friend is in your hospital." Elena looked down the hallway toward room 417. "Yes." Another pause. "If he dies," the voice said quietly, "someone here dies with him." Elena's expression did not change. She simply responded with calm precision. "Then it is fortunate he is still alive." The line went silent again. Somewhere far across the city, armed men holding hostages listened carefully to the voice of a quiet night nurse inside a hospital ward. And for the first time that night, Elena allowed a small part of her former training to surface. Not openly, not dramatically, just enough to keep the situation from collapsing into violence. The voice on the line did not answer immediately. For several seconds, there was only the faint static of the connection and the quiet rhythm of hospital monitors echoing through the hallway. Elena stood beside the nurse's station holding the receiver, her eyes moving calmly across the ward. The staff around her continued their work without realizing that a hostage negotiation had just entered their hospital. Finally, the man on the other end spoke again. His voice was colder now, more cautious. "If he is alive, prove it." Elena's gaze shifted down the corridor toward room 417. Inside that room, the wounded suspect remained sedated, unaware that his condition had become the center of a negotiation involving armed men and innocent lives. Elena spoke carefully. "He survived surgery. The bullet passed through the lower abdomen. No organ rupture. Blood loss was controlled." She paused briefly before continuing. "His heart rate is stable. He is sedated to allow the body to recover." The man listened without interrupting. Elena knew what he was doing. Hostage takers often tested details, searching for inconsistencies that would expose a lie. Medical information was difficult to fake convincingly under pressure. "Let me hear him," the man said. Elena shook her head slightly, even though he could not see the movement. "That is not possible." Silence again. Then the man's tone sharpened. "Why not?" Elena answered with calm precision. "Because he is unconscious and connected to surgical monitoring equipment. Moving him or waking him would risk internal bleeding." Another pause followed. Elena could hear faint voices in the background of the call, the hostage-takers speaking quietly among themselves. Somewhere across the city, 2 civilians were likely sitting on the floor under armed supervision while these men decided what to do next. Elena understood the pattern. The situation was balancing on a narrow line. If the criminals believed their partner was safe, negotiations would continue. If they doubted it, the hostages would become expendable. The man returned to the line. "You sound very certain." Elena did not change her tone. "I am the one monitoring him." "Then you understand what happens if you lie to us." Elena glanced briefly at the patient monitor above the station before answering. "Yes." The word came out quiet and steady. On the other end, the man spoke again. "Our friend told us something before he lost consciousness." Elena waited. He said someone in the room moved like military. The hallway behind Elena remained calm. A nurse walked past carrying a stack of folded blankets. The security officer leaned against the far wall, reading something on his handheld radio display. None of them noticed that Elena's mind had become very still. "People say strange things when they are injured," she replied calmly. The man did not respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a hint of curiosity rather than anger. "Maybe." Elena said nothing. The rain outside had softened to a steady drizzle now, the storm slowly moving away from the city. The man continued. "But we are not stupid." Elena listened carefully. "If someone trained is inside that hospital," he said, "then they know how situations like this end." Elena answered quietly, "Yes." The man let the silence stretch again. Then he spoke the sentence that shifted the negotiation. "Bring the phone to him." Elena's eyes moved toward room 417 again. The request was dangerous for several reasons. Moving the call closer to the suspect might reveal background sounds or equipment that confirmed the hospital's location, but refusing outright might convince the hostage-takers that the nurse was hiding something. Elena felt the weight of the decision settle into place. Around her, the hospital ward continued functioning as if nothing unusual was happening. A patient monitor beeped once and returned to normal rhythm. One of the nurses at the station yawned while updating medication records. Elena understood the quiet truth of the moment. If the negotiation collapsed, those hostages across the city would likely die. But if she followed the demand carelessly, the criminals might learn exactly where their partner was being treated. That knowledge could bring armed men directly into a building filled with vulnerable patients. The man on the phone spoke again. "You still there?" Elena answered softly. "Yes." "Then move." Elena did not argue. She placed the receiver against her shoulder and walked down the hallway toward room 417. Her steps were calm and measured. The security officer watched her pass but did not question it. Nurses walked in and out of rooms along the corridor, continuing their routine tasks. To them, she simply looked like a nurse answering a phone call while checking a patient. Elena pushed open the door to room 417 and stepped inside. The room was dim except for the glow of the monitor beside the bed. The wounded suspect lay motionless under the thin hospital blanket, oxygen tubing still in place. Elena closed the door halfway behind her and moved closer to the bed. She held the receiver a short distance from the monitor so the steady beep of the heart rate sensor could be heard through the line. "You hear that?" she said quietly. On the other end of the call, the man listened. The slow, consistent beeping of the monitor passed clearly through the connection. His heart rate, Elena explained calmly, 78 beats per minute. Silence again. Then the man exhaled slowly. "Good." Elena remained standing beside the bed, watching the man's breathing rise and fall under the blanket. The hostage-taker spoke again. "If he wakes up and finds out we are still holding them, he will not be pleased." Elena did not react. The man's voice shifted slightly. "You seem very calm for someone caught in the middle of this," Elena answered with simple honesty. "My job is to keep patients alive." Another pause. Then the man said something unexpected. "You remind me of someone." Elena did not ask who. Instead, she returned to the negotiation. "Your partner will survive if his recovery continues without interruption. And if it does not." Elena's eyes moved to the surgical bandages covering the man's abdomen. "Then he will die slowly from complications." The man understood the implication immediately. Any attempt to retrieve the suspect by force would likely kill him. The line went quiet again while the hostage-takers considered that reality. After nearly 20 seconds, the man spoke once more. His tone had changed slightly, less aggressive now. more thoughtful. You said he is sedated. Yes. How long before he wakes up? Elena answered honestly. Several hours. Another long pause followed. Elena could hear faint background movement again, chairs scraping across a floor somewhere far away. The negotiation was shifting toward a new phase. The man returned to the line one final time. You keep him alive, he said quietly, and maybe everyone else stays alive too. Elena looked down at the unconscious suspect. Then she replied with calm certainty, That is exactly what I intend to do. The connection ended a moment later. Elena slowly lowered the receiver from her ear. The quiet hospital room felt unchanged, yet the entire situation had shifted. She placed the phone back against her shoulder and stepped into the hallway again. The nurses' station continued its routine activity. No one asked where she had been. No one asked what the phone call had been about. But Elena understood something the others did not yet realize. The negotiation was now tied directly to the survival of the man lying in room 417, and that meant the safety of everyone in the hospital might depend on how long she could keep both sides of the crisis under control. When Elena returned to the nurses' station, the ward looked exactly as it had before the call. The monitors continued their steady rhythm above the desk. The charge nurse was reviewing medication charts, while another nurse prepared the early morning blood draw kits. The security officer walked slowly past the hallway intersection again, his radio murmuring with routine dispatch updates. Nothing in the room suggested that a negotiation with armed hostage takers had just passed through the hospital telephone line. Elena placed the receiver back on the station hook and resumed charting as if she had never left. Her movements remained calm and controlled, but her mind stayed focused on the wider situation unfolding beyond the hospital walls. Somewhere across the city, 2 civilians were still being held at gunpoint. Their survival now depended on whether the hostage takers believed their wounded partner would live. Elena glanced up at the ward monitor screen again. Room 417 continued displaying stable readings, heart rate steady, blood pressure slightly improving. The surgical team had done their job well. The man would survive if no new complications appeared, and that survival was now the thin thread holding the entire negotiation together. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The rain outside the windows slowed to a light drizzle as the storm moved away from the city. In the distance, faint sirens echoed through the wet streets. The charge nurse stretched and stood from her chair. Almost 3, she murmured. If the night keeps going like this, we might actually finish early. Elna did not respond. Instead, she quietly adjusted 2 patient charts and walked down the corridor again. She entered room 417 and checked the IV flow rate, then examined the surgical bandages for signs of bleeding. Everything remained stable. The unconscious man breathed slowly under the oxygen line, unaware that his survival had become part of a negotiation between armed criminals and federal authorities. Elena stepped back into the hallway and closed the door halfway. The security officer appeared again near the station, this time speaking more seriously into his radio. "Repeat that," he said, his voice lowered slightly. "Hostages released." The nurses nearby looked up immediately. "What?" one of them asked. The officer held up a hand while listening. After a moment, he nodded slowly. "Understood. Situation contained." He lowered the radio and looked toward the nurses. "Police just ended the hostage situation downtown," he said. "Everyone's safe." The ward responded with quiet relief. One nurse exhaled heavily. Another shook her head. "That must have been a long night for those officers," she said. The security officer nodded. "Yeah, negotiators talked them down." Elena stood silently near the hallway entrance while the conversation continued around her. No one connected the news to the earlier phone call she had taken. No one asked whether the wounded patient in room 417 had anything to do with it. The hospital simply absorbed the news and continued working. Elena returned to the station and resumed updating the digital chart entries for her patients. A few minutes later, the internal phone rang again. The charge nurse answered. "4th floor medical." She listened briefly, then covered the receiver with her hand and looked toward Elena. "Someone asking for you," she said. Elena stepped forward and accepted the phone. The voice on the other end was the same man who had called earlier, but his tone had changed completely. The tension was gone now. "It's finished," he said quietly. Elena glanced toward the hallway before answering. "I heard. Your confirmation kept them talking long enough for negotiators to secure the release." Elena remained silent. The man continued. "Both hostages are safe. The suspect surrendered without further violence. Elena felt a small shift of relief pass through her chest, though her expression remained unchanged. "Good," she said. The man paused before speaking again. "There is another matter." Elena waited. "The wounded suspect in your ward will be transferred into federal custody once he is medically cleared." "That is hospital policy," Elena replied calmly. The man exhaled softly. "Yes, but there was also a question from command." Elena did not respond. The man continued carefully. "They asked whether you intend to remain where you are." Elena looked around the quiet ward. Nurses moved calmly between patient rooms. The security officer returned to his routine patrol. Outside the windows, the city lights reflected off the wet streets as the storm clouds began clearing. "Yes," she said simply. The man seemed to understand. "Then nothing more needs to be said." Elena nodded slightly, even though he could not see the gesture. "No." A brief silence followed before the man added one final sentence. "For what it's worth, they were right about one thing." Elena waited. "You still move like an operator." Elena's voice remained calm. "Good night." She ended the call and returned the receiver to its place. The ward continued its quiet routine. No one asked what the conversation had been about. The nurses simply assumed it had been another administrative follow-up related to the news about the hostage situation. Time moved forward again. Around 4:30 in the morning, the first signs of dawn began appearing faintly beyond the hospital windows. Elena completed her final patient checks and finished documenting the overnight observations. In room 417, the wounded suspect remained unconscious but stable. Two plainclothes officers quietly arrived shortly before sunrise and took positions outside the room without disturbing the rest of the ward. By the time the day shift nurses began arriving, the situation had already been contained. Elena removed her gloves and placed the last chart file back into the station system. The charge nurse glanced at her. "Quiet night after all," she said with a tired smile. Elena gave a small nod. "Yes." She removed her badge from the station scanner and walked toward the staff exit hallway. The morning light was beginning to spread across the city skyline outside the windows. In the elevator lobby, one of the plainclothes federal officers stood waiting. He glanced at Elena briefly as she approached. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he gave a small, respectful nod. Elena returned the gesture without stopping. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the ground floor button. The doors closed quietly. A few minutes later, she walked out of the hospital entrance and into the cool morning air. The rain had stopped completely. Traffic was beginning to move through the streets as the city woke for a new day. Behind her, inside the hospital, the night shift ended like any other. Charts were handed over. Patients were checked. Staff moved forward